Thank you. Good afternoon.
And a little bit overwhelmed today of being here, introducing this high-level panel with two of the best European economies, at least alive, in Europe, and such a hot moment for the monetary policy. I must confess that moderate Philip Lem, just after the new rate hike adopted by ECB last Thursday, is like a dream for a financial journal, but I promise I will behave, so I will try to refrain myself, at least a little. It's also a pleasure to share stage with Mr. Maggiori, who is leading this amazing project named Global Capital Allocation, very useful in this, to understand today's capital flows around the world. I do really invite you to check out his website. What happens next with the Chinese capital allocation will surprise you. So today we will discuss the dynamics of the financial system in the euro area. This is the topic chosen by Mr. Maggiori, and I will say he's thrilling to have a critical exchange of views with Mr. Lane, who is one of the teachers or researchers that he has studied the most during his career. Before getting started the debate, let me share or let me comment some housekeeping notes, right? We are going to go straight to the dialogue, and after the dialogue, we will have some room for questions from the audience, so we will do it by microphone. Someone from the organization will bring the microphone to you. I will please ask you to try to be short and refrain, as I am going to do, as much as possible. So the talk is going to be lively. We have disagreement, and if not, I'm going to push you a little to try to know more about your opinions, or to really find out what is this about this incredible phenomenon of global capital allocation. For me, in advance, if I interrupt you a little, if you are going too long in the answers, trying to make this as lively as possible, as I mentioned. So let's start by painting a picture for the audience of your main areas of study. As academics, and Mr. Lane now as a policymaker, are focused on understanding global financial data, figuring out who owns what around the world. So why it's so important to know this? Why should we care about, for example, the Russia or the China pattern of allocating money or global capital? Maybe Mr. Maggiori, who is our prize winner, may start.
First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. And thank you, Philip, for coming over for the debate. About 20 years ago, we really didn't think that who owns what was so obvious of a macro question. And then 3 crises have completely changed how we think about this scientifically. So the 07-08 financial crisis, the European sovereign debt crisis, and then COVID showed us that we need to know and be very careful about concentrations of risks. Think of like AIG in the US on the eve of the financial crisis. Or think about who owns sovereign debt in Europe when we get a crisis in the periphery. That one turns out to be a very important question. It tells us where the losses are. If there are market dislocation, what is the role, or is there a role for the ECB, for public policy, to step in? And so that one has changed dramatically. And as a result, both we worked academically in general on theory, but also on data. 10, 15 years ago, Philip was at the forefront of this and starting to build the first systematic data sets to tell us who owned what around the world. But until very recently, we couldn't go much farther. Now, because collectively we realized that this was important, the private sector, the public institutions, and academics have really come together trying to get hold of massive amounts of data that give us a pretty precise picture of who does what around the world. And so that has changed dramatically. If today you want to know who owns sovereign debt in Europe, we can get a pretty close picture, something that we couldn't have done 15 years ago. We could have only given you some pretty broad brush pass at the question. And you can see with COVID, that became pretty crucial, or with the Russian sanctions. If we want to sanction Russia, well, we need to know where they own the assets. Do they own them directly, indirectly? Are they via offshore tax havens? All of those become pretty relevant very quickly. Yeah. I promise I'll be short.
Yeah, really short. I'm amazed. I'm positively surprised. So, Mr. Lane, you were the first recipient of the Bernard Prize, doing precisely research on this area of study. But now, as a policymaker, you care in your daily basis, in your policy-making decisions about this, who owns what?
So let me give two levels to that question. One is really a global question, and Europe is super open to the world. We're super open to Asia. We're very closely connected to the US and globally. And then second, there's a second question, very relevant for the euro areas. Within the euro area, is it the case that we have essentially a lot of interconnection across the member countries? And very importantly, is that interconnection stabilizing, or is it a source of instability? Because who owns what helps us to answer that question. So let me go back in time. 30 years ago, in the 1990s, the work I was doing to start my career with John Maria Milesi Ferretti was basically looking for every country, what they owe the rest of the world and what do they invest in the rest of the world. So it was how much vis-a-vis the rest of the world in general. And that gives you a lot. But then the next question to ask is, indeed, who owns what? And the data on that only started to become available about 20 years ago. So there's an initial wave of super aggregated data. It might be country to country or sector for some sectors. Whereas now, there's more capability, including, or especially when you combine official data from national statisticians with essentially private sector data, like Matteo's work with Morningstar, where you look at the individual mutual funds and you learn a lot from that. So here's an example where public-private interaction between official data, commercial data can go a long way. But for me, it's both questions matter. One is, when I look at the euro area in general, I really want to know who around the world, who are the global investors in the euro area? Because then, if there's an event in Asia, if there's an event in North America, the implications for us matter quite a bit. But then also within the euro area, I really want to know, if there's some development in Germany, who in Europe is exposed to that development and who is less exposed. So it's a complicated question, but fundamentally, it's an important question.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's touch base on the hot topic of the moment. And this is for you, Mr. Lane. What are the threats posed to the euro area financial system by raising interest rates?
So let me first of all interconnect it to what we just said, which is, of course, for me, there are three different ways to think about this. One is a macro point of view. When the interest rate goes up, what sectors are most affected? And then over time, what do we expect to see in terms of employment, consumption, investment? So that's the kind of macro channel which we say there are long lags that we are observing. A second channel is basically the flow of credit. So basically, when we raise rates, we make new loans more expensive. And we also, for that matter, in terms of portfolio decisions, for example, the choice between owning a government bond, owning an equity and so on, putting money into a bank account, then those decisions are altered by the interest rate decision. So that's also interesting. But then it's the third element, which I think interconnects most, which is the repricing of existing portfolios. So the effect clearly on the value, if I bought a bond in 2021, the value of that bond, which was issued under a low interest rate environment, is quite different today. If I bought a dollar asset compared to a euro denominated asset, the exchange rate has moved in part because of different interest rate decisions. If I am trying to value commercial real estate or residential real estate, and here this goes to who owns what, because the exposure to existing assets when the interest rate changes has a lot to it. Let me focus on here basically moving away from low for long. So we had a world where essentially lots of people believed that interest rates would be very low without interruption for a long time. And clearly that mattered for the valuation of many things. I just mentioned a few financial assets, but let me also mention the valuation of firms, especially tech firms or startups, because these firms have profits maybe years from now, and so the value today of profits that only kick in 5 or 10 years from now depends on the interest rate. So we've seen, I think, a big exposure through the revaluation of tech firms, any firm that relies on intangible capital, for that matter. And so this is what we are looking at. We're looking at how do people respond when the value of their portfolios goes down. And here again, let me already point out something that many people talk about is how much does it matter for someone who intends to hold a bond to maturity? So you may have a paper loss, but in terms of your actual behavior, if you intend to hold it to maturity anyway, the behavior is quite different. Whereas if an intermediary holds a bond and they then force to sell it because it's a bank like SVP where the depositors run, or it's an investment fund if we have a scenario where the retail investors in that fund get nervous, that is the risk factor. So far, it's been very smooth in Europe. We have seen reallocations, but we have not seen anything too dramatic. So far, it's been quite smooth, the adjustment to the higher interest rates, but clearly we're always watching.
Okay, and dramatic is not a central scenario at all. I mean, to see this.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Right. So we agree and disagree before we met. Yeah. So I would like to know if you see the same risks and threats or another way.
So I'll touch on something that Philip mentioned, and then I'll take it in a slightly different direction. So, the way to think about dislocation in financial markets, particularly when it comes to quantities, it's a bit like a car accident. So slowing down, if you do it over a long distance, it's perfectly fine. It gets to you if you need to do it in the next 2 meters. And so when something moves a lot, like interest rates recently, the problem is, are you going to get a car accident or are you going to get a smooth slowdown? So the US got a little bit more of the car accident happening. So they had several banks fall because the depositors were taking their money out. They were not trusting the solidity of the bank. Why? Well, because on the asset side, the bank had a lot of duration risk. So interest rate risk that was generating losses. That we haven't seen in Europe. So far in Europe has been smooth. Now that's not a guarantee that it's always going to be smooth, but from an ex ante perspective, how do you go about judging whether it's going to be smooth or not? And that's where knowing who's exposed to what matters. You want to know, are there any parts of the financial system, either in the banking system or in the non-banking system, that are particularly exposed? So a lot of the research that I do is about trying to figure out these things ex ante. And so one of the very interesting things in Europe is that traditionally, Europe has been loan-based. But over the last 10, 15 years, the financial intermediation coming from the non-banks, so the bond market being held, for example, by pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, has been skyrocketing. Now that's a pretty distinct form of intermediation from a bank because they don't have deposits. They sell shares to the public. And there is a question of whether this is beneficial because it solves the problem of bank runs, or it's going to come with its own problems. Now, if the assets are very liquid, most economists think that this is going to solve some problems. If the assets are very liquid, then you get back to the same. Imagine a mutual fund that owns corporate bonds in Europe, but the bonds are very liquid and hard to sell, and the public starts to want to withdraw because they're thinking, for whatever reason, that they're going to be credit spikes. Now, that one gets you into trouble. And in fact, the Fed, during COVID, had to intervene by buying ETFs on the open market because they were invested in corporate bonds. Again, we haven't seen it in Europe, but the way the trend is going with these positions getting bigger and bigger, down the horizon, we might have to start thinking about how do we want to regulate this sector. We have done a lot of regulation in the banking sector coming out of the financial crisis, but that hasn't happened. The part where I'm going to sort of deviate away from what Philip was discussing is a little bit more of the sovereigns. So one big question worldwide, not just in Europe, but in Europe is particularly acute, is fiscal sustainability. You have large sovereigns with a lot of debt over GDP, and debt is cheap to roll over if interest rates are low. So Italy is solvent at very low interest rates because it's easy to roll over and repay. If interest rates spike, we see problems like we saw back in 2012, also here in Spain. Now we have, for the first time in many years, a shift to a higher interest rate regime. Now, to be fair, real rates haven't really gone up that much. It's mostly nominal rates catching up to inflation. But there is a valid question whether a few years down the line, we're going to go back to a low interest rate environment or we're going to shift to a permanently higher interest rate environment. And if that's the case, how do the sovereigns react to this? How easy is it going to be to maintain fiscal discipline, not just in Europe, but also, for example, in the US? The US has skyrocketed its debt to GDP ratio from 2005 to today in an environment where debt was extremely cheap. In fact, so cheap that repayment has gone down. So the level of debt has gone up a lot, but interest rates have come down so fast that interest payment on debt have actually come down historically in the US. Now that might change. And if that changes, it's another big shift where we have to ask ourselves, are we ready for it? Are we going to get a smooth slowdown, an adjustment to a new reality, or are we going to see a car accident somewhere? And in Europe, it's particularly important because we don't have a fiscal union. So Italian debt is distinct from German debt or Spanish debt, and who owns it? It's a very relevant policy question as we go to a permanent, or perhaps a permanently higher interest rate.
So in the interest of being energetic, let me follow up on what Matteo just said, because I think it's a very big question, but let me break it down into two different questions. One is the future of real interest rates. So this is the famous or star debate. And in the IMF World Economic Outlook, they basically concluded a lot of the forces will most likely keep real interest rates low. And there's a lot of studies around, and there is uncertainty about it, but I would be in the camp of saying, as far as I can see, by and large, we think real interest rates will be low in the coming years. It remains the case the forces behind low real interest rates, I think, may well dominate, but with uncertainty. With uncertainty. So let me focus on, this is coming from my central bank world, the other element, which is of nominal interest rates, which is inflation. So right now, what the market is confident in, and I think correctly because we'll have something to do about it, is that inflation will come down to our target fairly quickly in the next couple of years, to 2% thereabouts. And for this reason, 10-year bond rates, the most important rates for governments, are basically some average of the policy rate for the next 10 years, plus some risk premia. If we do not bring inflation back to target in a timely manner, there's a risk that the market will start to believe inflation will not come back to 2%, and it might settle down at 3 or whatever number you want to think about. If they believe inflation is going to be at 3 or some other number indefinitely, then the long rates will rise a lot more. And this is what Matteo has said, the interaction with high public debt, which is nominal debt, and higher nominal rates, that would be give a very different dynamic. So the sovereign debt markets have been relatively orderly and contained, fundamentally because of the market confidence, which is also our confidence, that inflation will come back to 2% fairly quickly. So when you look at 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's priced on the basis inflation will be around 2. And so this is why, going back to your basic question, unless we raise rates now to be sufficiently restrictive that inflation comes back to 2%, the paradox is this is the route for interest rates to come down because inflation is solved. If inflation is not solved, then the interest rates over the next decade will be a lot higher. And so what Matteo has raised has a policy angle to it, which is a lot turns, not on the real side, which is kind of global fundamentals, but on the nominal side, it depends on monetary policy doing its job.
Okay, I will look back later to the shadow banking issue, but let's go a little bit further with the hiking rates scenario. So the ECB has said it will look at 3 key parameters when making future decisions: the inflation outlook, the dynamics of underlying inflation, core inflation, and the strength of monetary policy transmission. That means how higher rates are affecting borrowing and lending. May I ask you, Mr. Lane, do you expect to continue hiking rates at every meeting for as long as these 3 conditions are not fulfilled?
So, one of my main tasks is to rephrase questions I get.
I was going to say, do you want me to answer?
Let's answer.
I spend a lot of time making sure I don't form expectations about the future, because what I need to be is data dependent. I need to be data dependent about the inflation outlook, which let me subdivide. There's 2 parts to the outlook. One is the base case, and last week we updated the projections where there's a lot of focus on the baseline. But the outlook is also the risk around that base case. So we were always looking about, are these risks becoming more severe to the upside, to the downside? And last week we listed out, here's the factors we're looking at in terms of risks to the economy and to inflation. Number 2 is we don't want to only rely on forecasting. We also need to, if you like, interpret the incoming inflation data. And the reason why we use the phrase underlying is what we need to really focus on is that part of inflation we think will stick around unless we respond with monetary policy. And so we're looking at all sorts of measures which adjusts for what shocks are temporary, which adjusts for the very large effect of energy and food shocks on core inflation and so on. And I will continue to do that, but I do it with an open mind rather than saying I have some expectation. And then the third element is strength of monetary transmission. What I've focused on repeatedly is history has not had all that many hiking cycles. You cannot be certain, no one can be certain about how monetary policy works in this very unusual circumstance. We have very good modelling at the ECB, but the models are very sensitive to all sorts of specification choices. So we have to be data dependent about this. So I think President Lagarde phrased it last week, which is basically, unless there's a material change in the outlook between now and July, it looks like another hike in July will be appropriate. And then basically we will see in September. That's months away in terms of all the data we're going to learn about between now and September. We'll also have a full-scale forecasting round in September. So September will be decided in September. July will be decided in July. Let's see where the data go between now and July. But where we are now, where we've a lot of hiking already done, it's not the case that I think it's very likely we need to kind of provide a lot of forward guidance. Last December, when we had a reassessment that inflation was going to be quite high for too long, we basically said we intend to do several hikes. At this point, we're much more a kind of truly data-driven. July is not that far away. We can say, unless there's a material change, another hike. But that leaves open, if there is a material change. And then for me, September is so far away. Let's see in September. Let me find, because this question is very popular, is people in the markets who are investors, they need to make decisions every day. We don't. We make a decision. We made a decision last week. We'll make a decision in late July. We'll make one in mid-September. So I really, honestly, every day do not need to update my views every day. I need to update my views at every monetary policy meeting and no more frequently than that.
Thank you for the answer. But what about to take a raise, or what you say in the central bank jargon, to pause? Could you see yourself pausing as the Federal Reserve just did?
So again, let me say, this is universal central banking rather than trying to frame us compared to the Fed or anything like that. Universally, and you look at many different examples in the past, any central bank at any point in time may say, today we did not raise rates. We will continue to look at the incoming data, and if appropriate, we will hike again in the future if needed. So that's not just the Fed, other central banks have said in this cycle, many times in the past, is that true? So I think, of course, it's an interesting phrase, but I don't find it that interesting, because it basically says, because I mean, the counterfactual is what? That if we ever stop hiking at that day, we say, that's it forever? I doubt it. You know, because data dependency could be, you decide today not to raise rates, but then one meeting later, 2 meetings later, 3 meetings later, the data will say, well, actually, you should start hiking again. So, and then after the fact, only after the fact do you know whether you paused or not. Because only after the fact do you know, did that turn out to be the peak or just a pause, as you say. So foreshadowing, that is maybe interesting for people to talk about, but not for us. For us, it's meeting by meeting, and what we decide in one meeting doesn't determine what we do at the next meeting.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Maggiori, I was thinking in your idea of the car accident, and apparently one of the main reasons for a car accident is to watch another car accident. It's very common, very frequent. Is there any chance that maybe Europe is watching the car accident from the US and can happen another car accident here?
So I think that's what we refer to as self-fulfilling panics. So the idea that you see something happening somewhere and you start worrying that your own house might have the same issue. As Philip said, in Europe so far, we haven't seen it in this hiking cycle. Markets have actually been relatively well behaved. There was some concern earlier on with the sovereigns of market segmentation, but it hasn't materialized, at least aggressively. Now, these things tend to change very quickly, very much like car accidents. So there is no guarantee that this is not going to face us in 3 days or 2 weeks. But it's certainly true that the market has tolerated this rate increase without large dislocations. I think what has been interesting in this particular cycle is also Europe relation to the rest of the world. So there have been some pretty large capital flows worldwide. One very large one right now is China, because China is slowing down, or at least once they opened from COVID, their recovery hasn't been as swift as many have thought it was going to be, and the political tensions with the US are an all-time high. So in the European data, you can actually see it. A lot of investors are getting out of China, so that's happening. And part of that is also interest rates in the US and Europe being high. You're not searching for yield all over the world. So those things are happening. But as far as Europe right now, there haven't been particular problems.
Okay. Mr. Maggiori already raised his worriness about shadow banking and how out of control may be, or kind of, right? Some people blame shadow banking partly for the 2007, here in Spain, 2008 financial crisis. What are the threats of shadow banking as opposed to the traditional banking system? What should we be fear of?
No, I think it's a very important phrase. And I think what the phrase tells you to do is, when you look at the non-bank financial sector, say, what elements of that is basically banking, but basically in the shadows? And what elements of that is basically not banking? So Matteo already highlighted, I mean, a lot of the bonds in Europe are held by investment funds. In turn, a lot of investment funds are by and large long only. They're not leveraged, and therefore it's not a bank. I mean, a bank is highly leveraged, has deposit funding, bond funding, and so on. So if it's long only, someone's taken a loss, but that's just, it's regrettable, you regret it, but it doesn't lead to the kind of dynamic that you would have if a bank's capital gets eroded. So what's very important is when we look at the non-bank sector, we're always hunting exactly for, is this basically a shadow bank dynamic, or is it basically less leveraged, it's long only, and it's a hit to someone's wealth, but it doesn't have the same dynamic. So within the investment funds, There is a degree of leverage there, depending on the fund. There's a degree of synthetic leverage because they may hold derivatives which de facto create synthetic leverage. There is an issue which is runnability, which I think you mentioned also, which is if you hold non-liquid assets, but your investors expect to be able to cash out, minute by minute or day by day, then that's a potential risk factor. That's not particularly new. I kind of remember in the 1998 Asian financial crisis, it was redemption runs, on some investment funds played a role. And this goes back to inspecting the data. And so far, we've seen a lot of stability in the investment funds. It's not the case there's been a major... and this goes back to what I said earlier on. I mean, it makes a big difference. What did you expect from those investment funds? Are you holding them for a capital gain? Or are you holding them basically as part of your long-term asset allocation? So let me go beyond the kind of being very narrow about this. And maybe this is a conjecture, not a... by and large, in Europe, the kind of investor risk appetite is probably not as high as in the US. People are not, if you like, necessarily doing a lot of day trading or doing a lot of investing they basically, for a lot of people, they've allocated to the investment funds and they don't necessarily overtrade them. That they would say that that's for 10 years from now for my retirement. Whereas in the US, there's a degree of more high frequency retailers, non-retailers, hoping to get juiced up leverage returns at a higher frequency. So the dynamic, I think, we have to recognize the European financial system. Quite often people complain about lack of risk appetite, but lack of risk appetite sometimes can be stabilizing as well. So again, that's for the purpose of debate, a conjecture.
Well, for the purpose of debate, let's profit that you are an outside watcher of this. Would you have some kind of regulation that you would like to propose to try to make this shadow go on the lights?
Right. So, absolutely. So let me mention two things. One is an example of what Philip John mentioned, which is not all funds are the same. So some funds are pretty levered. A pretty spectacularly bad example was the debacle in the gilts market when the UK tried to pass what they call the mini budget. The word mini turned out to be a misnomer. And what had happened there was that some of their pension funds had located in Ireland and were buying gilts, which is the treasuries of the UK, on a highly levered basis. And this trade, or at least the size of it, caught the market and the regulators by surprise. And it caused a pretty large debacle in what is, a G7 sovereign debt market. So that's a typical example of, you think everything is fine, this is sort of long only, we don't have to pay a lot of attention, and then even in a G7 market, these things tend to generate price movements that we wouldn't like to have. Now that one was relatively short-lived, the Bank of England had to intervene, but it could have been much worse. Particularly if it had come, for example, in the midst of a much more general panic. This was very UK-specific and somewhat self-inflicted. Actually, entirely self-inflicted, let's just say it right. Now, there's two other things. So one part of regulation is, if it's a bank, you have to regulate it like a bank. Mm-hmm. And right now we don't, or at least we're at the beginning of that process. But then there is another two problems. One is, imagine that a large chunk of the assets of the economy are now in the hands of retail investors. Retail investors are panicky, much more so than professional investors. If you're, for example, suppose that you run a mutual fund that invests in corporate bonds. That's your business. You can't deviate from that. You can't all of a sudden buy 50% of your allocations in treasury. And if they want a redemption, you have to sell. And that's the problem. And we haven't seen that one happen yet. We've seen snippets. I mentioned COVID, some of the COVID corporate bond market action in the US and in part also in Europe. But as these get bigger and bigger, this is going to be a problem that we're going to confront again and again. And it's not so big of a problem for markets that are very liquid or where there is a lot of capacity to absorb the other side of these flows. Think of like, equity markets or the treasuries. There we don't worry as much. We worry as a structural trend if these players get very big compared to, for example, say hedge funds or specialists that could take the other side of the market very quickly without large price movements. So how, on any given day, let's say that allocation of capital is fixed, but when you look over 10 years, these things do evolve. And right now, the trend has been these passive investors are getting bigger and bigger. The other thing I would mention that sort of changes the view a little bit, there isn't just a problem of what they actually do. There is also a problem of how much as policymakers or academics can we see of the world through these operations. And so that's very important in Europe and has been the subject of my most recent research. So in Europe, you would think it would be pretty straightforward if you want to look at Spanish households and you want to know how exposed are they to Italy. If Italy goes down, what are the wealth losses to Spanish households? Well, Spanish households generally buy mutual funds. But as you know, most of you buy mutual funds that are located in Ireland or Luxembourg. And those funds then hold assets that might, for example, be the Italian treasury bonds. Now, per se, that might be totally benign. In fact, it might even be efficient. You might be paying lower fees or have access to better products because those funds are being sold throughout Europe and you're not stuck with a Spanish product at very high fees because the market is too small. But it does create a problem for the rest of us to understand your exposure. In particular, it's surprisingly difficult to see through these links, even within Europe, and figure out ultimately who's exposed to whom. So to give you an extreme example, think of a Spanish households buying BMW bonds issued by the subsidiary in the Netherlands via a Luxembourg fund. If you're at the ECB or an academic and you're looking at this data, it looks like a nightmare. You're looking at a position from the Spanish households into Luxembourg, a position from the Luxembourg to the Netherlands, and then a position in FDI, not even portfolios, from the Netherlands back to Germany. So what would have been a pretty straightforward allocation of capital, a Spanish household buying a bond issued in Germany by BMW, turns out to be nothing but. Now, a lot of that might be totally benign, but it does create a different issue, which is, if there is a crisis and we want to know what are the exposures, how quickly can we get these answers? Right now, that's where the frontier of work is. We're trying to figure it out. But if you think that we have those answers readily available, no, we don't. We're slowly trying to make progress, and Europe is particularly interesting in this case. One, because a lot of the financial intermediation happens in 2 or 3 countries, and second, because we don't have a fiscal union. So the same, at some level might be true in the US. A lot of financial intermediation happens in New York. But the US has a fiscal union, has very harmonized regulation. Europe is a little bit different. And so this always brings up the risk of unforeseen segmentation, that something breaks along the line, particularly under stress. So that's what I'm excited about these days, trying to figure it out.
Okay, he doesn't look as calm as you with this shadow banking thing. Should we be calm or not? And may I ask you, do you follow his research, like to try to track this problem that he just named as a nightmare for ECB policymakers?
So maybe I'll make a few points. First of all, Matteo and his group are collaborating with the ECB, which is, I think, a win-win to have that. So there's a nice collaboration ongoing and more to come. Second, I would say where we are now is huge progress compared to what was there before. And if those of you who are kind of involved in those years from 2008 to 2012, working out exposures, at the very least now we have a single supervisory mechanism. So understanding what banks, and the ability, not just the data sets, but the ability as supervisory mechanism to have a very good understanding of what's going on bank by bank is fundamental. And I would say this is a very stabilizing pattern. By the way, there's also, because a lot of funds are connected to banks, so there's also insight, even if you, unfortunately, there's not a data set we can say to Matteo, here you go, in terms of truly kind of soft knowledge we would get by so people know a lot more in pockets than is written down in a data set. But I would also agree, fundamentally, I would like to see more progress in developing higher quality look-through data. So we do have everyone agrees on the goal. We should connect the ultimate owner and the ultimate exposure. But as Matteo just said, the reality is the scale economies, the efficiency of having essentially various locations across Europe who are specialized in financial services, is a reality, even if it sometimes makes the data a bit hard to understand. And let me come back. I mean, we just came out with the Financial Stability Report a couple of weeks ago, which has a lot of very interesting analytics about all the risks that we are focused on, which are mostly tail risks. But of course, this is when life gets interesting, when a tail risk might develop. So there's a lot of progress has been made, but there's a lot more to do. I mean, I would say, that we'd be a lot happier with more developments in banking union, more developments in capital markets union, which can allow the private sector to diversify more, and also more developments on what we like at ECB to focus on is essential fiscal capacity, so that there is a kind of more balanced role in Europe, rather than having too much of the fiscal kind of action going on at the national level. Now, we all have one very specific example in the pandemic. It was so stabilizing to have next generation EU. It was so stabilizing to have that. And also things like the Sure bonds and so on. And so we do think having weakening the doom loop between national sovereigns and national financial systems is very important. And so having more of a central fiscal capacity would help for not just macro reasons, but also for financial stability reasons.
So you just brought one topic on the table, is the incomplete capital markets union, and even in the incomplete banking union. The two reforms are recurrent requests by ECB to the European Commission, but they are still ongoing. We don't know exactly at what stage. So the ECB closely monitors market fragmentation, especially in its transmission of monetary policy. I'm wondering, how do you assess the extent to which the euro area is financially integrated today? I don't know if you could tell us, both of you, any big historical trend that may continue.
Well, from my point of view, and in connection with this debate today, I put on the ECB website as a background set of slides. So the Commission, we have a joint kind of a conference with the European Commission, and that recently was held in Brussels. So I have put out some indicators of financial integration. And they're all interesting, but because they don't answer ultimate owner, ultimate exposure questions, there is a limit. So let me focus again on I think, what's very important is, and you said it yourself in terms of ultimately what we want to know is the financial system, in what ways is the financial system going to be a source of stability? And in what ways is the financial system going to be a source of instability? And there's two elements to that. One is, how does Europe and the world respond to some common shock? So the pandemic was a classic shock. The war in Ukraine is essentially a common shock for Europe, even if there's some differences across Europe. But of course, from the point of view of Europe, it's also very important to answer the hypothetical of what happens if a country or group of countries gets into trouble. And what's been very interesting in this hiking cycle is essentially the relative stability of essentially spreads. So the spreads are obviously a very important indicator to look at. And let me go back to two or three fundamental reasons. One is the inflation is largely a common problem. There's a strong belief, which we will deliver on, that we will get inflation back to 2% in a timely manner. And so long, which is my point earlier on, so long as that is true, there's not a fundamental challenge to basically the coherence of the euro area. Then second is, a year ago now, we introduced the TPI, the Transmission Protection Instrument, which is basically saying if we see an unwarranted panic, if we see something where there's a reallocation away from certain European countries towards others, if we assess that basically this is not justified by fundamentals, it goes back to the inherent always possibility of a run basically, then we will be prepared to intervene. And I think that has played a role. It has played a role that essentially people should not believe that kind of 2010 to 2012 can happen again in terms of the elements of that which connect to panic, the elements of that to the lack of a backstop, because we have the ESM backstop as well, and the elements of that which relate to a lack of information. With a single supervisor, with a lot more disclosure, some of the ingredients where panic can arise are much less likely now. But we always have to be on guard, always have to be vigilant. And so coming back to the basic question here, is we know a lot more now about who holds what. So at the ECB, we have what's called the securities holding statistics, which tell us not just in the aggregate, but also by sector in many interesting ways, that the pattern of cross-border flows. Again, in the slide deck I put on the website, there's some interesting new balance of payments subdivisions, if you like, by sector. So you can inspect what I put on the slide deck in terms of the sectoral composition of flows. Because, of course, if flows are basically coming from long-only investors, you might be a lot more relaxed than if flows are coming from highly leveraged investors. We might say, well, tell me the ultimate investor there. Are they going to be retail investors who might get a bit nervous under some conditions? Let's see. So we are putting out a lot more data. More is always better. But what I would say is right now, the European system, I think there's a lot more faith that the ECB will solve in terms of the common shocks of inflation, stabilising the European economy. Next generation EU, because right now the money's being spent here in Spain and elsewhere. It's a lot of stability for next generation EU. And then in terms of future tail events, it doesn't hurt that we now have this TPI instrument. So people understand that the ECB, where it sees a panic event, has the determination and willingness to intervene if needed.
Mr. Maggiori, apart from replying the big historical trends, I will ask you to be politically incorrect, because maybe, well, in 20 years you are sitting that chair, but today you are in those chairs. Why do you think politicians are reluctant to adopt this capital markets union?
Okay, so I actually am pretty bad at forecasting politicians, but I can tell you a little bit about the capital market union and where it's going. So, when you look at Europe over the last, say, 20 years, since the introduction of the euro, there is a lot of success and there are some well-known problems. So certainly there is much more integration than before. That has been beneficial. From its very foundation, it was well understood that we were getting into a monetary union without a fiscal union, and that one had its own problems. It's not that we discovered ex post that it was a problem. In fact, we've known it all along, particularly among economists. Perhaps it wasn't communicated as well to the general public, but that this was going to be a problem, we knew. And the ECB has done, in my view, a pretty amazing job of fighting this problem. But it's still a structural problem, it's a real problem. And it's one that not only gets sorted with more and more integration. And of course, there are political realities and political limits to the willingness to integrate when it comes to fiscal space. And that one, as you all know, has been a very active topic of resentment among some European capitals because they're perceived as one-way transfers. They're not perceived as ex-ante resharing under a veil of ignorance. They're perceived as we know which way the flows will go in a crisis. But a lot has been done. And going back for a second to the data Philip mentioned, the SHS data of the ECB. So at the very beginning today, I mentioned that over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of convergence between academics, the industry, and policymakers on trying to understand these questions and going hard at them. And the SHS at the ECB is probably the state-of-the-art product. So my collaboration with them has, in part, is on the basis of that data. And we're getting better and better at getting to the final answers that we care about. But the capital market union, there's still many problems. One is, withholding taxes in Europe aren't quite harmonized. But as we lower these barriers, there is another aspect that shows up, which is, of course, the private market is going to use lower and lower barriers to optimize their own private gains. And their own private gains need not be social gains. So one very active topic in Europe is, for example, profit shifting. That happens for large corporates. And by the way, it's not a problem just within Europe. Many international corporations, particularly American multinationals, tend to use heavily European jurisdictions for these purposes. And so this is going to become more and more of an issue as we widen this market and we remove barriers, because they're going to use all these certain margins to their benefit. And it's going to, as you know, even here in Spain, has been a political issue very recently, as I understand, with one of your transport companies. But it also brings up an issue of fairness at the European level. We're going to have to discuss the public the extent to which making these markets be together and making these capital flows very easily is also generating broad-based prosperity rather than accumulating at the very top, in either the wealth distribution or in multinationals. And again, it's very easy to depict every flow that goes cross-border as bad. That's certainly neither my intention nor the reality. But what we have to do to create social value is analyze the part that isn't perhaps socially valuable and figure out how do we go narrowly after those parts of the system. And how do we, whether they're making it unstable or whether they're generating gains that are very concentrated in the hands of very few people that can operate at that scale. That, I suspect, is going to keep happening in the euro area as a very broad conversation as we generate more integration.
Okay, so this is going to lead us to the last question before going to the audience in case you want to figure out your questions. So, as Mr. Maggiori was mentioning, if something defines the euro area is the diversity of its economies, very different ones. Some countries play a large role in global financial markets and in hosting multinational activities, at least compared to the size of their domestic economies. I guess everyone in this room is thinking of your home country right now, Mr. Lame. So we would like to know what challenges, costs, and benefits do they pose for the euro area? As far as I think Mr. Maggiori is concerned, there is this Brexit impact that is still ongoing. Financial system is adjusting, so maybe can even exacerbate the financialization of some economies as Ireland, for example. How do you see it? What are the challenges, costs, and benefits?
So there's a lot in that question. So let me first of all differentiate between the economic impact and then the impact on financial systems and maybe more precisely financial data. So clearly, until recently, we've had this very strong increase in a mix of global value chains, but also the rise of kind of superstar firms, which basically are able to roll out the same activity around the world, or their products basically have a global impact. And these firms are able to optimize the global pattern of production, but also the global, if you like, financial configuration. Many different kind of affiliated firms, many different ways to optimize the kind of, if you like, the allocation of profits and financial flows. In part, there's been a big response, which is not fully hit home yet, which is the OECD tax reform. So the OECD tax reform goes a long way, and it's been a remarkable, if you like, convergence among many countries around the world. Parts of that have starting to hit home. parts will be more visible in the years to come. So that's one issue. Number two is there's no doubt statistics are organized along national lines. But when you have global firms, the kind of how to interpret global firm GDP in a world where global firms can reallocate intellectual property around the world quite easily is quite something. And Ireland definitely, when I was involved, was quite involved in how to rethink financial or national statistics in that world. And it's very important. And in Ireland, I think there's been a lot of progress. So everyone understands gross domestic product is a misleading number. And people focus on modified domestic demand. They focus on adjusted gross national income. And so this is where other countries honestly need to do more. Other countries may need to do more to reflect what Ireland has already, because of the scale of it, has had to do, which is coming up with economically useful concepts rather than just focusing on what's easily available, like GDP. What is true, and of course, the paradox of globalization is globally it can make the world a lot more efficient, make the world a lot richer. But with the interconnectedness, it does mean if there's a decision by a firm to basically reorganize production, then you can have quite sharp dislocations, because these firms are so big compared to the economy that the decisions of a relatively small number of firms can move GDP in either direction quite a bit. Ireland's had a run now where it's been mostly in one direction, which is more and more intellectual property coming in. But of course, everyone recognises conceptually there's a risk some of that could reverse at some point. So definitely, for Ireland, it's one thing. For any other country, because it's not unique, Netherlands, UK, Luxembourg, other places to a greater or less extent. Let me come to the Brexit question, because that's very interesting. And Madrid, of course, is one place, Dublin's another, where what's happening, and it's visible now in the data, is by and large now, global financial firms need to serve their European customers from an EU entity. So what we're seeing in the data now is less, if you like, probably going from the UK, less flows to and from the UK to Euro area, but more flows within Europe, because they've now got an operation here in Madrid, they've got an operation in Paris, they've got an operation in Dublin, Luxembourg, and so on. So this is going to be, I think, a classic study in the years to come, is to, on top of everything else, mapping the Brexit effect on the reorganisation of the European financial system. Now, what I think is also true, and maybe some of those, I can see in the room there's some financial experts, by and large, this is essentially a tidying up exercise. These are, in the end, the decision makers are global decision makers. They're running very large global operations, and they understand they need to serve their European customers from an EU destination. But in terms of facts on the ground, how much this makes a difference, let's see. Because in the end, it's always the case, these firms are organized ultimately on a global basis.
Not surprised. Thank you all for your time and this opportunity. Thank you, Matt.